Okay. Welcome back after this delicious fika that we just had. And I once again want to say thank you to our speakers today, Amber, Tom, and Frida, for such interesting speeches. I think there was a lot of parallel things, but there were also some differences in your presentations, of course, but also different perspectives on similar topics. And I think also there was a lot of textiles, which is nice since I'm a professor of textile. But also here at Steneby we have the Textile Body Space program, and we have the metal, and we have the furniture design with specialization wood. And I think you, Tom, framed those or included all those materials and perspectives in your presentation in a very exciting way, I think. So hopefully it can be inspiring for our students that are here today to make new furnitures and metal objects, as well as textiles, of course. With that said, I of course, as a moderator and curating this, I see a lot of similarities and things where you intersect and could perhaps inspire each other. But I would like to hear if you have any comments or thoughts after listening to each other, if there's anything you want to comment on that some of your someone said, or if there's something that inspired you, or something that you didn't thought of, or something that you want to develop in relation to each other, or something like that. Yeah, who wants to start?
I can start.
Yeah,
I can start.
Yeah.
Does it work?
Yeah.
I was just curious if you have any thoughts about Mary Lowndes doing a banner to, for example, Mary Wollstonecraft, where she, in the 18th century, writes on femininity and embroidery, and how embroidery was domesticized female. Have you any thoughts about that? Because I find it very funny that Mary Lowndes did a banner to her in the practice of embroidery. So it's kind of a interesting track. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, she was quite... in some of her writing, Mary Wollstonecraft was quite disparaging about textile arts and about the concept of fashion in general as well, wasn't she? And about this kind of the sort of prettification of women and how women were meant to present themselves. So I guess it is interesting that her name was then used in these textile banners. But I also think you couldn't really leave her out of that sort of that history that they were telling through those banners of politically significant women within various different art forms. I think it would have been remiss to leave her out. And I guess also it's a kind of you have to consider the context in which Mary Wollstonecraft was writing. And at the time in the 18th century, I guess it was very radical for her to be saying these things that she was saying. Before people were able to really consider the subversion of these textile arts that then came throughout the sort of 19th century, especially as we both see in Rosika Parker's work. So I guess you have to look at the historical context, really. And yeah, I don't think they could really do that history of British, women and sort of feminism without including Mary Wollstonecraft.
No. Yeah. But it tells a little bit about the shift that Parker is pointing out in the...
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think so, absolutely. Yes, I think before, like in the 18th century when Mary Wollstonecraft was writing, I don't think there was necessarily, I mean that shift hadn't yet, I think it was kind of too early for it to be considered radical as a practice, I guess. I think we sort of start to see those stories throughout the 19th century, and then by the time of the suffragettes, and of course the arts and crafts movement in the latter half of the 19th century, where the concept of craft is really, sort of put back into various curriculums and put back into sort of hierarchies and things. But at the time that Wollstonecraft was writing, that really hadn't happened. And I think industrialisation has a big sort of impact on the way people were thinking about craft, and especially in the UK with people like William Morris, which was really sort of, backlash to industrialisation. But when Mary Wollstonecraft was writing, it was very much just at the sort of beginning of that sort of mass industrialisation, and so there also wasn't that to draw on. I think it's just about historical context, basically. Yeah, but that's a good point. That's an interesting question. Yeah. I had a question about the Chicago Archive. Mm-hmm. What's the history of that as a collection?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so that was the Leather Archives and Museum in Chicago. It came about in the 1990s, and one of the major forces was Chuck Renslow, who he ran a lot of bathhouses, and he also founded the International Mr. Leather competition, which has been going for kind of 35 or 40 years. I think it was the 40th anniversary of International Mr. Leather. And so that was a community, it's a community archive. And because I think the leather scene is a group that's very aware of its own traditions, because it's built very much upon different kinds of rituals and, and moments historically. So like, Easy Rider and, those kind of moments within the kind of development of a style. They felt that there was a need to historicise, and it was quite controversial when it was set up, because there was also a feeling that putting money towards an archive was taking money away that would have gone towards HIV/AIDS projects. But it was very interesting doing research in there as a professional historian and seeing what other kind of users were coming through, particularly as I was there around the time of International Mr. Leather. So there were people from around the world coming to the archive. One person who was saying he was Mr. Leather, where was he from? No, he was from Taiwan. Yeah, he was from Taiwan and was doing research into traditions of boot blacking, shining boots, in the leather scene, so that he could date this back to Taiwan and teach the other leather people in Taiwan how to do it properly. And so that's also a kind of element of this archive, I think, is where it's also a community that's really concerned with ideas of authenticity and order and doing things in the right way. So there's also that kind of, it's used as a reference point. People from different places in the US were coming and kind of doing research into that.
Do you have any thoughts on the other presentations, or?
Yeah, so I was interested because we're talking about different political figures and talking about Mary Wollstonecraft, and I noticed Ellen Key was in one of your slides. Yeah. And it really struck me how in a lot of the examples you have, there's this link to the trade union movement through the materiality of banners. And then also in that 1975 Rösker show, where there are, references to, it felt like particularly Chinese socialist realism in the way things looked. And so there's this sense and kind of feeling within the objects of collective solidarity that's been transferred from, I think, trade union movements to women's movements.
Trade unions.
Yeah, but I think there's a kind of shared logic in there, and a shared logic within the materials was a sense I was getting. And I was wondering about because you mentioned Sara Ahmed, and so Sara Ahmed I think was mentioned a lot in last year as well. But it strikes me, reading Sara Ahmed, where you have these ideas around willfulness, that it's a very kind of individualized idea. And I find in her writing, I find it difficult to see a kind of a broader collective notion of kind of responsibility or finding rights. And, you know, willful is a word that I use to describe my dog when he doesn't obey my orders, you know. So I wondered about that issue of how do you see this kind of, you know, this kind of value that there is in a kind of collective class consciousness among women, and then how kind of feminist craft practices are performed and enacted today.
Oh, today. The shift to today. Oh. Sorry. Well, it is interesting because I also noticed that Sarah Ahmed is talking about the subjective in an individual perspective, and in my presentation here and also in my dissertation, I see the shift to or do a reading on the material that is the together making that is a big part of the so-called subversive act in making. So yeah, that's I can see that also in relation to the material. Yeah. But in relation to today, that is a because I don't see that my practice is subversive. I'm not. That's the difficult part to because it deals with the where the practice taking places in the institution that I'm already included in the institution, for example. So that's yeah. That's my answer to it. But I find it difficult to see that today.
But also that it might be outside of the art school, because probably once you've got into art school, that's probably, if you weren't already middle class, that's probably when you become middle class.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I want to, like, because you talked about today, like first the past and then today, and a possibility to shift. And I think, I mean, all three of you work with a history in one way or another, like art historian or design history, or as a craft artist using the history to perhaps visualize or make visible the past to, I guess, potentially like create a change in the present context. Can you say something about that interest, like from a personal and professional perspective, like why the interest of the past, and what do you wish we will bring with us from the past, or what's the aim with like using so much from the past in your work, like using the history as, I mean, it's in one way a very basic question, but also a huge question. But you can talk about it in the way you feel.
That's a very difficult question for me to answer, actually, because everything I do is concerned with history. So sort of trying to, because I'm a historian, it's very much what I'm sort of compelled to do, I guess. I've always been interested in the past. And I think it's, in some ways, I think it's a bit of a cliche to say we need to learn from the past to look to the present. I mean, if we look at history, we can see that that has never really happened. We don't tend to do that. But I think it can help us to contextualize the present, I think. And I just think having an understanding of the past is... I really don't know how to answer that. It's just what I've always been drawn to do, is to look at the past, to look at people that came before us. What do you think? It's design history.
On the working class library in Manchester, they have a sign that I have been thinking about a lot in relation to my interest in the past. explore the history to change the future. And I find it very like part of the maybe will, but also how archives and histories, like an understanding of the today and the issues that we still are struggling with can be understood in relation to history.
I do actually also, though, you make me think, coming from the UK, it can be quite dangerous. We're going through a moment in Britain where the past is often being weaponised to spread particular political messages. And the past is really being, there's this huge sense of nostalgia in many groups in the UK at the moment. And in some ways, that idea of like learning from history, you can't move for like Winston Churchill quotes and stuff in the UK at the moment. It can become horribly nationalistic. So I think you have to be careful when you're thinking about history in public discourse, and think about the purpose of that history, and think about who's telling those stories and which stories are being told as well. I think you have to be more careful than ever at the moment when you're considering histories actually coming from somewhere like the UK. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I was interested in moving to Sweden and really noticing a kind of a failure to embrace perversity within LGBT movements, and I was always wondering why do I hate Pride festivals so much? Why do I find them really annoying? Why am I annoyed that this is a children's festival? And it was kind of I'm really driven by irritation. And so that kind of made me want to understand, partly what's been happening historically. So part of the broader theorization around this project, and I think one of the things that a lot of people in the leather community have reacted against was the adoption of what you would call kind of an ethnic model of sexuality. So that was where we're talking about crossovers between workers' movements and kind of models for women's suffrage, then looking at kind of American civil rights and how racial civil rights became the kind of main model for gaining rights within the LGBT community. And so there are kind of, with any kind of methodology that you adopt, there are kind of, there are, it's been a very successful approach, but there are always people who are then excluded when you produce a new framing. I mean, that's kind of the kind of nature of identity politics. So often those kind of resistances and those kind of insistences on perverse behavior, on engaging in perverse design, that's what I guess kind of drew me to that topic, because of that sort of irritation at a very kind of sanitized idea of identity, which I find to be very old-fashioned in many ways, about kind of sexual object choice.
I also want to ask you some about class, because class is also something that you mentioned now in this panel, but also you, Frida, have worked a lot with the class perspective, I know, and it comes also in with like queens, like things also that you have mentioned, and the suffragettes and so forth. So I'm curious, like from the perspective of class, for example, Tom, when you talked about this, like, could you see, is there an exclusiveness or a difference in perception in relation to class in the work that, or the research you're working on? And with Frida, is there use in the meaning of the object, or how you visualize the objects in relation to craft? Or Amber, I guess the same question, like, can you say something about how you relate or perceive your work, or if there's certain aesthetics or things in relation to craft that you see in your practice or research?
Shall I start? Well, class is something that I've been dealing with in many ways, both from the experience of coming from a working class environment and stepping into, as you said, to the academia and making me a middle class person, and what that means in relation to identity but in relation to I don't know how will class is a concept, a difficult concept also, or it's very difficult because it's not a fixed concept. It moves. So I don't know.
Anyone else that wants to make a comment, or?
I think the leather scene. I mean, it's quite kind of tricky in class terms. So the evidence there is, so Gail Rubin is done the kind of most research kind of into the social history of the leather scene, and so in her work she talks about and this is in America, talking about there being a kind of relatively wide range of people from different classes, particularly in the early years, particularly in the 60s, 70s. And also a wide range of political belief as well within the scene. So, you would meet Republicans and Democrats who were interested in sadomasochism would meet each other. And there are probably not very many Republicans in the scene today. So I think that's something I would be really interested to know more about, is how there is a kind of political consolidation, how that works along class lines. But one thing that's quite difficult is talking about, is all of this expensive stuff, of these kind of barriers of access. And so some of the literature on BDSM kind of tries to deal with this. But it's quite simplistic, I think, because it's talking about, if you want to buy a kind of, kit out a dungeon or get, expensive whips or something, that talks about this kind of capitalist exclusion of people. But that tends to be something that's applied to queer communities that isn't applied to areas like fishing, for example, or other kind of leisure pursuits. And that's one of my reasons for kind of trying to frame this in terms of leisure and hobbies. Because fishing is something that might simultaneously be seen as a working class hobby that has a lot of expensive stuff that you can buy and is associated with it. So I think it's also, in terms of materially, looking at what's available, looking at what price, it's still actually quite difficult to draw direct lines between class and the kind of the social makeup of the community. But I think, that's what I was trying to get at a bit with looking at the Sears catalogue as an inspiration for dungeon furniture, because I think taste is a much better kind of way of thinking and approaching class. But I'm still kind of at the beginning of working out how to really deal with that in this project.
I think it very much links the British textile biennial that I mentioned that I was at, that's sort of happening in these mill towns in the north of England. Really all of the programming was about textiles as political resistance and how it's being used, but also specifically dealing with class and the heritage of those working communities in a place where that industry no longer exists. Very much similar to what you were discussing as well in your some of your talk. And I was involved in some panel events there, and it's really interesting because people feel that heritage viscerally in the way that if you go to coal mining communities or former coal mining communities, again a parallel that you drew, you have that sort of shared sense of that history and that livelihood having been taken away. And it's really interesting looking at the history of textile production from that perspective versus this kind of, what became known as this very refined middle class and upper class practice of, you know, the idea that how good you were at needlework really defined how good you were as a woman, sort of in many ways. And so you're looking at very different histories there, both of which are equally rich and equally interesting, I think, but absolutely different types of production and different class histories there as well.
But,
Can I? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, but linking to that, because we're talking about, you know, how good you are as a woman and needlework, and that kind of link to DIY, being good at DIY is something that you have to do to be a man. And something I've noticed in the literature is this kind of split between craft and DIY. So in Julia Brown Wilson's book Frey, she talks about the kind of home production of strap-ons among lesbians. And it's really interesting that that's craft, it's not DIY. And that these men are definitely doing DIY, they're not doing craft. And so there's also this, and these men, because they're doing DIY, they're not expressing themselves, they're doing something very practical. And the women who are making these strap-ons are expressing themselves through the strap-ons. And so there's that, you know, even, you know, I think people who are writing very critically about gender, it creeps into our language still. But I just wanted to pick up on that point that there is this analogue about being a good man with making skills as well.
Becoming Respectable by Beverly Skeggs. Really, she's writing about class, but so becoming respectable in that sense is also an interesting concept or idea. Embroidery is making you a respectable woman, so class and respectability is an interesting track, I think, and something that I also write about.
If we then talking about the stitching and or the embroidery and the textile knowledge and so forth, and other craft expressions, you can see talking about the new materialism, or that the craft or applied arts also enter the fine art, which is a bit about what you talked about, Amber, that we can see that today, like at the biennales or the art exhibitions. There's been a boom, or there's been more with like crafted objects or artworks. Why do you think that is or is happening now? If you think that it is happening now, like, can you say something about the contemporary or the time that we're in now in relation to new materialism or craft art / the same thing? Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
I think maybe it's a bit reductive, but I think maybe the increase of digital life has led to a renewed interest in handcraft and handmaking, maybe. I think maybe there is some sort of parallel there between spending so much of our lives online, living in this sort of virtual world, versus actually making things with our hands. I don't know.
Yeah, that's good.
But I wonder if you can also talk about the kind of the growth of conceptualism and the continued dominance within fine art to some degree, because it struck. I was in a panel discussion a while ago, and it really struck. And this was on art and work, and there was a narrative given in that discussion that was, well, you know, we had this kind of like Joseph Wright of Derby in the 19th century, and we had these people depicting labour, and then art became labour itself, and we didn't need any product of it. And the problem is that excludes all of these, you know, it excludes people who are making things and talking about labour in that way. And yeah, I don't know if there's some, you know, I don't know what the relationship between those two phenomena is. But is it, you know, a frustration with what you meet in art galleries, the lack of tangibility as well? I wonder if there's a relationship between the dissatisfaction that's often felt in contemporary art galleries as well.
By the audience, you mean?
Yeah, by the audience, who don't have MAs in contemporary art, but would like to kind of engage with something aesthetically. Am I allowed to say that?
You're allowed to say anything. But I was also thinking if this digitalization makes a wish or an aim for some authenticity that maybe the craft objects relates to. But then also there's a commercialization related. I mean, that's one thing with the craft objects coming into the art gallery and that commercial context, but there's also design companies, huge. I mean, in Sweden we have they also pick up this craft skills, saying that things are hand or making things produce handmade or things like that. And then is it a risk then that craft loses its value? Like, do you see that risk, or will craft always have a value in itself? Like, what do you think is the future of craft in relation to authenticity, digitalization, production? Like, what's your thoughts on the future, if you would? Like, we talked about the past and the history and some about the contemporary situation. Now I want you to like look into the future and make it analyze.
Of course, it will affect the if all products will have labeling as like this is made in or this is handicraft or this is craft. It will be not so exclusive anymore. But
do you think it will be like that? Like, do you think everything will go?
I don't know. I can't answer that question. But I was thinking about in relation to handicraft or craft and home industry, where also there is a like production that is very close to craft, but it's not in. It doesn't have the same working condition as like in making free will, for example. And still home-based industry is still a very large industry production form. So, but not in Sweden, in the global south. But it doesn't have the same. Those kind of product doesn't have the labeling. This is handicraft, for example, or maybe they do. So that's also a difficult, to see what is a good working condition for handicraft practitioners, for example. That's a question mark that needs to be raised.
That was making me think of Susan Luckman's book, Craft and the Creative Economy, and her analysis of Etsy, where she talks about the performance that you have to engage in order to sell what you've made. And so she talks about the performance of yummy mumminess on Etsy and making, and this kind of thing of trying to increase the value by making it look easy, that you've made something, and that kind of paradox that she explores in that. I mean, for me, one of the next stages in this project is trying to understand how design companies in Scandinavia have been and still are using the Tom of Finland branding. So where you get this, sign up to the Tom of Finland company emails. They're quite funny sometimes. But it was handcrafted Finnish wooden dildo, and. So there's this, it's all of the kind of Scandinavian design cliches in that object, but then also trying to sell your salvation through liberation, but also because your liberation is allowed, because we've said it is. So there's this whole kind of packaging of Scandinavianness in those objects and a kind of updating. And there's that and that's the interesting thing about the mythology of Scandinavian design, because that's already... it's always been there. There's a V&A catalogue from the 1980s that talks about, the Arabia stuff, it's made in a big factory, but it feels like it's handmade. And it's interesting because that's definitely there within the kind of production within design around kind of sex and fetishism. Definitely that.
I'm not great on the future, to be honest. But I think in terms of fashion and craft, that like obviously the slow fashion movement is something that's growing, and also in the UK there are growing numbers of people making their own clothes at home as well, for enjoyment, but also for environmental reasons. Really is a sort of backlash to fast fashion and the sort of the globalization of the industry. I mean, in many ways, I think it comes down to the same sort of class issues that it did when William Morris was doing the same thing, and trying to go back to a pre-industrial time and using handcrafts and all this kind of thing, which is that mass manufactured objects are cheaper, they're more affordable, and they're more accessible in that way. So how do you overcome that problem? I think that's the issue. Handcrafted objects, the reason it's become a buzzword, this idea of handcrafted, is because it implies luxury. It implies the luxury of time in terms of the labour it took to make it. And so how do you create products that are, more environmentally friendly, that have this kind of ethos, but are also accessible to a wide number of people? I think that is the unanswerable, well, certainly unanswerable one by me. But I think that's a really crucial question.
And a great challenge for the for the students that's gonna be professionals in a few years. With that also, like, since we have a lot of students also here in the audience, both professionals but also a lot of students, I want to know how you come up with and find new projects, because I'm thinking as a student or as a practitioner and scholar, like, it's interesting to hear perhaps how you find your projects and ideas, or if they come to you or if you come to them, or like this, is it just by coincidence, or is it just how do you do it?
Well, every time I'm at a place like this one, I get new thoughts, and or if I'm in an archive, I like every place gives a new question that I need to follow, or I could follow. So that's how I find material often. When I'm at a place, for example.
But is it the visual, like, is it the practical things you see, or is it theory, or is it both, or like how?
It could, like, for example, the play that I'm rewriting now, Fabriksflickorna, Factory Girls, I found when we were exhibiting in the working class movement library and archive, when I was trying to understand home-based industry, I found the play. So that's it's an example.
You're searching at the right place.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, for me, history, it's very intuitive. It's seeing objects that make me ask questions. Why did someone think to make that? Is the basic question. And I think it's to kind of, also I think from a practice point of view, it's also to understand that, history is a very practical subject. So although the final report might be a book, it's actually the process of going to the archives, trying to get all of this chaotic stuff and make a narrative somehow from it. And so for me, it has to start with those things. I usually start projects with a very hostile relationship to all of the theory in that area. And then I find some of it's quite good. Don't know if that sounds familiar. So I guess that's my method.
I guess I'm kind of similar in that it sort of tends to come from the objects. and the objects that will spark a real interest in me in terms of the stories that I want to investigate that are related to those objects. Travelling certainly always sparks new ideas and new projects for me, whether it's coming to do something like this and meeting, fellow theorists and practitioners and sort of conversations that happen, or whether it's going to archives, collections, museums, galleries in other places, and through that experience, but certainly always through the objects and the excitement that you get from finding those things and seeing those things.
Because I think that's also interesting with the three of you, that you have a similar method, but you're a practitioner mainly in your theory. So I think it's good examples of how you can work with theory and practice very close together.
But also if a question sounds really naive, actually embrace it, I think, is the important thing to remember. Don't be worried if my previous book started with a question, why do communist things look communist? Which is a really stupid question, but it was a very productive question.
I think it's a great question. I'm going to read your book to find out the answer.
I didn't answer it. So.
But maybe inspire someone too. Yeah. My last question then, before we open up for the questions from the audience, is that, or maybe not a question, but can you say something about your next step? What will you do next? I mean, some of your specific project that you mentioned already and talked about, but you just say something about in your process. What is the next thing to do?
Already mentioned the Fabriksflickorna, the factory girls, that I'm working with Åsa Norman, former student here. And we are rewriting the play, and we're gonna have it's gonna be a short film, probably, hopefully, and we will also arrange a conference next autumn. But it's everything is under process, so we don't have a place, but maybe soon we have a place. And
here's a place if you're interested.
Yeah, I'll be looking at the influence of an artist called Bastille, or Frank Weber was his name. And I'm looking at his influence on the design of piss areas in sex clubs, which was in my original application. So Riksbanken want to know about the design
well done,
of piss areas in nightclubs. So that's my next few months.
How do I top that? Why do I keep going after you? It's just not fair. I'm currently in the beginning stages of research for an exhibition that I'm curating that will be opening in the Fashion and Textile Museum in London in 2021. And I'm looking at propaganda textiles, printed propaganda textiles, over about 200 years from various different parts of the world. And it was sparked, speaking of where do the ideas come from, by a trip to China last year and visiting the Propaganda Art Centre there, and also various trips to Moscow at times as well, which Tom and I were discussing with the whole why communist thing's communist, look communist. So that's what I'm working on at the moment, and I'm really thoroughly enjoying it, the research. It's really fascinating.
Send an invitation when I'll come and look.
I will do. Yeah. Well, this is an open invitation to all of you. Come to London, September 2021. Put it in your diaries now.
Great, thank you, all of you. And now I open up for questions from the audience. And you need to wave quite much because it's a light. Yeah, and you should get the microphone. So if Anders handling up microphone. Yeah. So you need to share that. And it's also good if you could say your name and who you are. Just if you're a student or if you come from an organization and things like that, could also be nice to know.
Yes, my name is Eva, and I'm a student at the Stockholm University of Arts, Craft and Design. And I'm asked a question to Amber Urti. And thank you all for great lectures, by the way. I want to say. We actually have a big problem at our school, the division between the fine arts programs and the craft programs. So I wanted to ask if you have any tips on any essays or texts that we could bring forward to the administration to start some sort of protest against this.
Well, I think the subversive stitch is a really great one to start with. To be honest, Frida may be better answer this.
I don't know. Subversive stitch. Well, it's like a ongoing issue. I think that it's still. It makes me sad that it's ongoing issue. But the subversive stitch, I think it's a good.
And also looking at textile art in general, perhaps also there's a lot of craft knowledge in the textile art scene that you can discuss maybe with your the school.
What course is it that you're studying?
I'm actually in the ceramics and glass department.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, let me think about that. It's where I teach, or used to teach a lot at London College of Fashion, University of the Arts London, and there wasn't, because it was all of the teaching, all of the academic teaching is done for makers, really. So it was the teaching there takes a very cultural studies based perspective, and because it's a fashion college, looks a lot at theories around embodiment and the relationship between the body and society. But that doesn't help you if you're studying glass.
No, it's just that I was just wondering if there were any a special essays or names or persons that that we could refer to more explicitly, because they don't. It's a question of money and space for us, so it's it's very hand-on. I don't know. I was just wondering, but I understand if there's.
Do you have any recommendations?
Well, I mean, Glenn Adamson's Thinking Through Craft is the kind of one that really, I think, talks through different objects about the historical construction that divides. So both Thinking Through Craft and the Invention of Craft, I think, is sort of the most thorough and very, very well respected books. They're quite dense, but once you get into them, it's really worth spending time with those books.
And perhaps also texts about new materialism.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ibrahim Blomqvist. I study here at Steneby at KMTO, which is basically a how do you say fördjupningsår? Depthening year. And my question is to I thank you all, by the way. My question is to Maja. I was thinking in regards to the thought process of deconstructing the gender identities that exist in today's world that either follow or are based on existing norms. And how do you begin to deconstruct that, or how does that thought process look like if you can put it into words?
You mean how
what's the first step? What was the first step you took?
For me, okay.
Yeah, specifically you.
The first, you mean in my artistic practice? Okay. Louise, who had the speech for the exhibition that was earlier today, she mentioned that I wrote a paper for a conference that was accepted at the conference in Sydney, and that was published in a book published by Berg, a British publisher, and that article was about a collection that I made called Collection L, that's now showed in an exhibition I have at the Norrbottens Museum up north in Sweden, and that's about stories and identities of lesbian, and where a group of people are involved in the project and they make clothes sort of based on their stories, or interviews are made with them about sexuality, identity, clothing. So I think that was made in 2008, I think. So that was, I think, the first project that was related to that theme, because that was also transgender and involved in that project. And before that, I also worked with theater costumes and things. That was also, but then I didn't own the project in the same way when you work as a costume designer as I did in this project. So I think that was the first project, and also the first project where I was writing more critically or more into depth of my own or about my own practice, because when I took my MFA from Konsthantverkscentrum in Stockholm, the theory part was not so much about your own practice. It was more like art and design history, that you were looking at someone else's work, but we didn't write and combined it with with our own practice. So that was like important in both aspects, I guess. I was both writing about it and making it from this perspective. So that's 11 years ago, maybe. Or maybe it was more, 12 years ago. I don't know, 2007, something, 2008. And I'm still showing it, and that's also not, in fashion, it's usually very fast. So I think that's also something that I like with that project, that I show it for over a long time. Any other questions?
My question, my name is Hampus, I study leather here at Steneby. My question is basically the same as Ibrahim's, but for all of you. Like, what made your interest grow within the area you're working in? What was the aha moment of what you're doing and what you want to say with your work? And also, what's your background in studying?
Shall I start? Well, I studied, I'm trained as a florist, arranging flowers at the gymnasium in Borås. And I wanted to make pots to my flower arrangement. That's how I started with crafts. But I think my question regarding the textile industry and where I'm at now and starting to be interested in the play of like Fabriksflickorna, it's dealing with the issue of what happened 1980 when the factory, the sewing factory and all the production left the Sjuhärad. What happened? It was like a story that were untold for me. So I think that's something that I return to very often. That period of time when all the production was outsourced to other places.
Well, I studied literature initially, and after I finished my degree, I didn't really have any idea what I wanted to do. I'd always really enjoyed researching, reading and writing, and really enjoyed the process of academia and school. And then after I finished, I kind of had this epiphany over the summer after I graduated, which was that the other thing I'd always loved was old clothes. And I'd always loved charity shopping and buying secondhand clothes from markets. It was always the sort of my primary method of acquiring new clothing, I guess, new old clothing. And so I got a job at my favourite shop, which was a vintage clothing shop. And I had no interest in fashion as I was growing up. I loved clothes and costume, and I was actually had a sort of antipathy towards the fashion as a system, towards the industry of fashion. I hated the idea of wearing something on trend. Didn't read fashion magazines. And then it was through working at the vintage clothing store I started researching the stories behind the pieces we were selling, the social history, the context. And then I went back to study for a master's at London College of Fashion in history and culture of fashion. And so that was where I sort of tied up the interest in the objects we'd been sort of selling and the sort of theory side as well, and the writing side. And so that was how I sort of started. But so there was no real moment. I mean, I didn't even know that sort of dress historian existed when I was growing up. So there was no real moment where I was like, this is what, where I sort of defined it, was like, this is what I want to do. Yeah. It was very much just sort of pursuing these interests. And sort of managing to sort of weave them together somehow
into
so a sort of patchwork career that I have. Sorry?
It just happened over time.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, that makes it sound quite passive. I mean, I certainly was, always pushing for new stuff and trying to, do more projects or do my own writing and various different things. But yeah, I was never, it wasn't like I was 6 and I was like, I want to be a fashion historian. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when I was about 10, I wanted to be a weather forecaster, and then I wanted to be an EU bureaucrat when I was 18, which is very lucky. So then I went to study modern languages, but I studied Russian and Czech as an undergraduate. And so then I spent some time working in the Sotheby's Russian department at the height of the Russian art boom. So it's this kind of selling paintings to oligarchs made me interested in visual things. And then being in Russia led to this question about why do communist things look communist? And I couldn't find any books about Soviet design. So I thought, I need to learn how do you do design history. So I went to study as a course at the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Royal College of Art. Which for me was a brilliant place to learn design history because you get this experience of working with collections but also being in a practice-based environment. So I think that was really important for my training, is kind of moving between objects and moving between conversations with practitioners, and that's something which is kind of very important for me in all of my projects, is that kind of voice of practitioners and understanding, being able to ask people why they decided to make something in that way, or I've had fascinating conversations in this project. How do you transfer an idea between leather and neoprene and latex? What's involved in doing that? And that kind of insight is what I really enjoy. But but that's a process of learning. How do you get to ask the right questions?
I should also say something. My background is that I studied my MFA at Konsthantverkscentrum, and then I studied after that a MA at Stockholm University in fashion studies, because I felt that as I said, the theory was not as much as I wanted at Konsthantverkscentrum. And then I have a PhD from School of Textiles. And I think for me the interest in politics and society has been important, and since I work with textiles or art and craft and design, that I have used that as a tool to make comments or create potentially at least a change. So I think that's the background and the reason. And then why I work with feminism and gender so much is probably because as a woman, that's what I have experience of a lot, or seen things that I want to change in relation to that, based on personal experiences.
Thank you.
Thank you for your nice presentations. My name is Anna, and I study at HDK in Gothenburg at the master's program of, I'm not sure the English term, but Master in Craft, with a specialization of textile. And I have a question for you, Tom. I'm just curious about, like, you started to speak about the innovation in, like, the BDSM culture, and when you spoke about this, like, wooden dildo, like, Scandinavian design, and I'm just like, how has that, because I get the idea that it's quite, as many, like, subcultures, quite traditional, like, in its aesthetics, and like, how, and then being, like, submerged in pop culture with, like, Madonna, and now it's just, like, how people dress, basically. Like, how has that affected, like, that, the design, like, innovation of design, and, like, also even, like, climate crisis, like, is there, like, an eco-friendly bondage store? Like,
so I think, ever since the scene started, there have been people trying to sort of protect the image. So, at one point, people dressed in latex were the worst thing, and then people dressed in puppy gear was the worst thing. And this was, one of the people I interviewed who set up Mr. S, or he took over the business Mr. S Leather in San Francisco, he was really, despised by a lot of people in the community for, selling things in materials that you weren't supposed to use. And then they would come in and sort of secretly buy the stuff. And so, so there's a question. I think there's a bit of a tension sometimes about, what does the word innovation mean? Because there's a mixture of, there's things that catch on, like the sleep sack, which became a kind of developed, an object that was developed, and then other things that are kind of, they're quite temporary, and they're sort of, they're more kind of faddish. And I think that's, once you get into, and this is the research I haven't really done yet, is thinking about, what happens when bigger brands start to grow in this area, and what does that mean? And then so that links to all of these kind of much bigger questions about the status of sexual identities within a kind of neoliberal capitalist system. And, I think that probably a lot of gay people have done quite well out of neoliberal capitalism, actually. And so I'm not trying to kind of position these kind of objects as just, as just a kind of sellout. Is actually, I think they are meaningful for people, but it's about unpacking meanings and kind of nostalgia and relationships to heritage. So I think there's this, so I think also you're getting at this kind of integration into the fashion industry as well. Particularly in the 1990s when, shops like Regulation in London, they started to employ fashion photographers to sell stuff, and then they could charge much higher prices. So you do see in the 90s that there is a kind of integration of aspects of fashion systems into gay fetish stores. I don't know about the others. Maybe that sort of answers your question a bit, but at the moment it's a few kind of disparate thoughts about that rather than a kind of coherent answer I can give you.
Maybe we'll see in the future.
Any other questions? Okay, Evelina, there will be the last question.
Thank you. Okay, so my name is Evelina and I'm a former student here at Steneby, Textile, the same department that Maja now works at, and also now I'm the manager of Gustavsbergs Konsthall in Värmdö. I have a question about the willful object, actually. I was just thinking or wondering if in your work, Frida, if the willful object is an object that is willful in opposition to non-willful objects. Is it? Do you refer to specifically objects maybe made with a political agency, or is it a way for you to maybe show that all objects are willful in one way or another? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, sort of. But I have been dealing with the willful, also in relation to like the you were mentioning about the not identity politics, but the individual view of the willful, but in Sarama's view. But if you look at like labels like fair trade, there is a will in that coffee product, for example. It says something, choose me and not the other one that's standing next by me. But it's there are hands that make objects. So there is no willful objects. There are willful subjects that makes objects. In that sense, I don't know if that's answering your question.
Yeah, I think
we load them with willfulness.
Because I don't know that much about that like discussion right now, but I have sensed or read or heard like a lot right now regarding in art theory or in philosophy that like the object's own agency is like more and more important in I mean
and that's also the new materialist point of view, like how material have agency. But I for example, I in the dissertation I draw from that, but not only. I have, for example, reference to Barad, that kind of theoretical framework, but it doesn't say the same as the willful object, for example, as in willful subject in Amund's. It's not the same. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that will be the last words for today. Thank you, Frida Hållander, Tom Cubbin, and Butchart.